Blood of the Swamps. Chapter 1. Helicopter in Flames. I never thought I would burn alive in a putrid cloud of kerosene and burning flesh. By the age of 34, I had seen death in many guises: mangled bodies under rubble, limbs torn apart by shrapnel, charred remains in the ruins of bombarded Afghan villages. But when my Black Hawk, hit by a missile, began to spin above the scorching sands, I truly realized for the first time, there are things worse than death itself, and fiery agony is definitely one of them. However, fate had set other traps for me. Sand. That damned sand was everywhere. It grated between teeth, hid in the folds of camouflage, clogged the air filters of engines. War in the desert is, above all, war with the desert itself. This thought spun in my head as I piloted the helicopter through the scorching haze 30 kilometers from Kandahar. The thermometer in the cabin showed 127 degrees, and we hadn't even approached the midday inferno. "Commander, movement at 7 o'clock. Miles, my navigator, shouted the words, and they pierced my consciousness like sharp shards through the roar of the blades. I jerked my head. Through the infrared sight, I discerned several dark silhouettes darting between ruined mud houses. First 3, no, 4 figures, and then something long on the shoulder of one of them. RPG, my shout merged with the sharp pop of launch. The rocket grenade traced the scorching air with a smoky trail. I had enough time to notice its tumbling in flight and calculate the trajectory. I thought the impact would come to the lower part of the fuselage, not fatal, but painful. I was wrong. The impact was so powerful, as if hell itself had splashed up from under the earth. The helicopter trembled like a wounded bird. Something cracked, hissed, and acrid smoke filled the cabin. Hydraulics failed. Thompson, my co-pilot, tried to shout over the wail of emergency sirens. "Commander, we..." He didn't finish. The second shot hit exactly the same spot. The hull couldn't withstand it. I felt a burning wave, as if someone had doused me with liquid napalm. In seconds, flames engulfed the cabin. Everything that followed happened as if in a nightmarish slow-motion film. The crew's screams, the crackle of fire, the smell. That smell I will never forget. I pounded on the hatch, but it was jammed from the impact. I beat it with my fists, my shoulder, my helmet, to no avail. I didn't immediately realize I was screaming. Not from pain, strangely, it hadn't come yet, from pure, primal terror. My body was on autopilot, acting on instincts developed through months of training. My hands found the emergency lever, pulled once, twice. On the third try, the hatch gave way with a heart-wrenching screech. The scorching Afghan air felt like blessed coolness after the hellish heat of the burning cabin. I tumbled out, rolling over the hull. My uniform was on fire. I rolled in the sand, trying to extinguish the flames, feeling how reluctantly they released their victim. Around me, automatic gunfire rattled. Bullets whistled. But I heard nothing anymore. Consciousness mercifully shut down, sparing me from the pain that was about to crash down on me with all its terrible might. I woke up in the Bagram hospital. White walls, the smell of antiseptics, the steady beeping of equipment, and pain, the kind that made me beg for death. Burns covered a third of my body. My face was almost unharmed, saved by the helmet with a fire-resistant mask, but everything else. "You were incredibly lucky, Captain Foster," said the doctor, changing my bandages. "A few more seconds in that helicopter, and we wouldn't be talking now." Luck, what a bitter word. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking of Thompson, of Miles, of Ray's. They weren't lucky. They remained there in a burning metal sarcophagus in the middle of the desert, and I survived. And now I had to somehow continue living with that. But that was just the beginning. In the following weeks, I discovered I couldn't be in enclosed spaces. Elevators, small rooms, even a car's interior, all triggered attacks of suffocating panic. Army psychologists called it post-traumatic stress disorder. I called it my personal hell. When it became obvious I would never return to flying, I was offered a position as an instructor at flight school. At least there, I could always go outside if it became unbearable. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the solution. I needed something else. Something opposite to everything I knew. And then I remembered the great cypress swamps. A land of endless space with no tight cabins, no scorching sand, no dry desert air. A place where I could start with a clean slate. I didn't know yet that this decision would draw me into a new war. A war not with enemies but with betrayal. And that one day I would have to choose between fire and water, between vengeance and forgiveness, between past and future. But all that lay ahead. Meanwhile, I just lay in the hospital ward, watching raindrops on the glass and thinking about water, about the healing, enveloping, cool water of the swamps that would one day wash away the burns from my soul. Chapter 2, New Source. St. Aubin greeted me with suffocating humidity and pouring rain. I stood at the bus station, clutching a worn army bag to my chest, watching as streams of water turned the town's main street into a muddy river, nothing like the Afghan desert. No sand, no heat, no ghosts of a burned crew that had haunted me for the past 8 months. In my pocket was a crumpled promotional brochure, St. Aubin Swamp Tour, exciting journeys through untouched corners of wilderness. Old Murphy, the business owner, was retiring and looking for a buyer. The price was ridiculous, clearly below market value, exactly what a man desperate for a new beginning needed. "So you're a helicopter pilot," Murphy squinted, examining the scars on my arms. We sat in a tiny office amid chaos of maps, boat motor parts, and yellowed tourist magazines. "And what the hell brought you to our swamp? Usually, guys after service settle in some sunny and dry places." "Maybe precisely because I've seen enough sun and dryness," I shrugged. No need to tell him about the nightmares, about panic attacks in confined spaces, about how I woke up screaming, feeling the phantom smell of burning metal and flesh. The deal took less than an hour. Murphy seemed just as eager to get rid of the business as I was to acquire it. We shook hands, and by evening, I became the owner of a fleet of 7 flat-bottomed airboats and a tilting hut on stilts that served as both office and warehouse. The first weeks passed in endless repair work. The boats were in much worse condition than they appeared at first glance. I spent days in the shed, changing propellers, tinkering with carburetors, patching cracks in the hulls. In a strange way, this work was calming. There was something meditative about fiddling with mechanisms while endless tropical rain rustled beyond the shed walls. Clients didn't appear immediately. First lone tourists, then small groups. They liked the quiet, scarred owner. I became a kind of local attraction, adding special color to their trips. And I liked taking people through the labyrinths of swamps where there was nothing but green infinity of water and plants stretching to the horizon. There, I finally felt free. Lauren burst into my life on a muggy August morning. She entered the office, dressed in light field gear, with a backpack stuffed with scientific instruments, and asked for a boat for a week. "I'm from Lowland University," she extended her ID. "Studying the dynamics of swamp ecosystem changes. I need to reach several points to take samples." I shook my head. "Not alone, safety rules." "Then will you come with me?" she smiled, and something in that smile made my heart skip a beat for the first time in a long while. "You can tell me about the area while we're at it. I'm new here." We spent a week together, wandering through the green labyrinths of swamps. Lauren turned out to be nothing like my image of scientists, no pomposity or dullness. She laughed at my jokes, admired my ability to find my way through the maze of channels, and in the evenings, in a tent on a small island of solid ground, told amazing things about the unique ecosystem of swamps, about rare plants and animals, about how this ecosystem had changed over millennia. "You know what's under our feet?" she would ask, tracing her finger across the map. "Whole deposits of methane formed from decomposed plants over millions of years. If this balance is disrupted, it would change the entire world." I looked at her, tousled chestnut hair, cheeks flushed from the heat, eyes shining with enthusiasm, and realized I was falling in love. For the first time since Afghanistan, I felt truly alive. Our first kiss happened at the Green Lagoon, a small cafe in the center of St. Aubin. Outside, tropical rain poured, while inside it smelled of fresh pastries and coffee. Lauren was telling me about her research, waving her hands and occasionally fixing a stray lock of hair, and suddenly she fell silent mid-sentence. "What?" I asked. "The way you're looking." "How?" "Like I'm some kind of natural wonder." "Maybe you are." I leaned across the table and kissed her, simply and naturally, as if I had done it 1,000 times before. The entire town gathered for our wedding 6 months later. Even old Murphy came from his retirement hideaway in the North Carolina mountains. There was much laughter, music, and dancing. And then he appeared, Dr. Victor Reed, Lauren's scientific advisor. "My best student," he said, shaking my hand. There was a strange note in his voice that I couldn't recognize then. "I hope you understand what a treasure you've acquired." I nodded, embracing Lauren's shoulders. I didn't notice how she tensed at the professor's appearance. Didn't see the quick glance they exchanged. Didn't attach importance to how often Lauren started mentioning Dr. Reed in our conversations afterward. Our life together flowed steadily and happily. During the day, I conducted swamp tour. In the evenings, Lauren and I sat on our house porch, making plans, dreaming of the future. Sometimes she would leave for field expeditions, usually for a week or two. She would return tired but content with stacks of data and samples. And then came the event that was supposed to change everything. An ordinary phone call on a muggy July afternoon. "Honey," Lauren's voice sounded excited. "Remember I mentioned a new expedition? We have a problem. Our driver's down with fever and we need to leave the day after tomorrow." I listened as she explained about the importance of the research, about grant deadlines, about how my piloting experience made me the ideal candidate for operating the new swamp amphibious vehicle. I listened and agreed, not suspecting that this conversation was the beginning of a path to a new hell. A hell compared to which a burning helicopter would seem like child's play. Chapter 3: Bogs of Deception. Light burned behind Dr. Reed's office door. It always burned, even at such a late hour, when the rest of the university building's windows had long been immersed in darkness. Lauren fixed her disheveled hair before knocking. Their meetings always took place at night, when the corridors emptied and there were no extra eyes and ears. "Come in, my dear." Reed's voice sounded as always, insinuating and soft, like the rustle of a snake in tall grass. The office smelled of expensive whiskey and cigars. The professor stood by the window, watching the rain drumming against the glass. At 63, he maintained what society ladies called a distinguished appearance, tall, straight, with perfectly styled gray hair. A true academic, the pride of the university. If only they knew. "Are the documents ready?" Lauren placed a folder with papers on the desk. "I added specifications for the new equipment." Reed smiled and a chill ran down her spine. Once, as a student, she found his smile charming. Now it seemed predatory. "Ah, our new equipment." He opened the folder. "Latest generation monitoring systems, autonomous data collection stations, portable spectrometers." On paper, everything looked simply magnificent. "On paper," Lauren echoed. She remembered how it all began. Second year, a special seminar on swamp ecology. Reed singled her out immediately, the only student asking truly profound questions. Additional classes began, joint projects. And then, "You know, in science, the main thing is knowing how to work with grants," he told her once. "Without money, no research is possible, and to get money you need a little creativity." The creativity turned out to be as simple as all genius schemes. The university received federal grants for studying swamp ecosystems, millions of dollars for equipping remote stations, for monitoring systems, for expeditions. And the fact that most of this equipment existed only in reports. Who would go check? Who would venture into impassable bogs to count sensors? 2.5 million this quarter. Reed tapped his finger on the figures in the report. Not bad, right? Of course, a significant portion will have to be given to our friends on the grant committee, but still. Lauren nodded. She had long learned not to think about the sums, just as she learned not to think about the old, rusting instruments that still stood at stations instead of modern equipment, about how she and Reed falsified readings, about how. What are you thinking about? His hand rested on her shoulder. Your husband. Ryan, at the thought of him, something tightened inside. Honest, straightforward Ryan, who saw her as a scientist genuinely passionate about her work, who was proud of her research. No, she lied, just tired. Reed leaned closer. He smelled of whiskey and the same cologne as 15 years ago when it all began. Then perhaps. The kiss was habitual, almost mechanical, like everything else that happened afterward on the wide leather couch. Afterward, buttoning her blouse, Lauren caught her reflection in the window glass. 36 years old and still playing the role of a love-struck student. But did she have a choice? She was too deeply mired in all this. Knew too much. By the way, about the expedition, Reed had already returned to his desk as if nothing had happened. We need to install new equipment at the Everglades station. Write off the old, update the documentation. You know the procedure. Yes, but, Lauren hesitated. There's a problem. Jim, our driver, is in the hospital, fever. And without a driver, we can't. Find a replacement. He didn't even raise his eyes from the papers. We're on a deadline. If we don't do this now, we'll have to wait until winter, and there'll be an audit in winter. Lauren bit her lip. The thought came suddenly, and it made her chest cold. Ryan, she whispered, he's a former pilot. He can handle the swamp vehicle. Now Reed looked at her, with a long, studying gaze. Your husband, new notes appeared in his voice. That's an interesting idea, very interesting. But it's a risk, she quickly added. He might suspect something. Or it's an opportunity. Reed stood up, approached her. Think about it. We go there, the three of us. He sees the real station, understands what's happening, and then, an accident. There are so many of them in the swamps, especially with inexperienced people. What? Lauren recoiled. You can't. I can do anything, dear. His smile widened. And so can you. Isn't that why we work so well together? Besides, haven't you ever thought about starting over, without this little lie between us? Lauren was silent. Fragments of thoughts spun in her head, about Ryan, about money, about how deeply she was mired in all of this, about how easily people sometimes disappear in the vast swamps of Louisiana. Call him, Reed returned to the window. Tell him we need his help, that it's important for your work, for science. He loves you, doesn't he? He'll agree. She took out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. Outside, rain poured, heavy, endless downpour, turning the university yard into a sea of mud. Somewhere far away, in their cozy house on stilts, Ryan was probably sitting on the porch, waiting for her return, not suspecting that every word of their upcoming conversation was already written by someone else. And remember, darling, Reed's voice was barely audible over the sound of the dialing number. In science, as in love, there's no place for sentiments. There's only results. Chapter 4, Deep Quagmire. The Marlin swamp crawler resembled a hybrid of tank and boat, huge tracks for moving through boggy ground, and a flat-bottomed hull for traveling on water. I circled the machine, checking each detail with the habit ingrained over years of service. Humidity and heat turned every movement into a struggle, and the metal heated up so much it burned fingers on contact. Any small thing could turn into a fatal problem in the middle of impassable swamps. Everything okay? Lauren's voice sounded unexpectedly close. She stood nearby, in light field gear with multiple pockets. In the suffocating humidity, her breathing seemed heavy, ragged. Seems so, I tapped the track. Just strange. According to the documents, the machine is almost new, but the signs of wear. All these numbers in papers, she waved her hand. You know bureaucrats. The important thing is that it runs. Dr. Reed appeared last, when the sun had already risen high and turned the air into hot soup. His movements were precise, measured. He clearly wasn't on such an expedition for the first time. A backpack stuffed with some instruments, a thermos of water, a tablet with maps. Ready for adventure, he smiled, extending his hand to me. I hope your piloting skills won't be needed, although anything can happen in the swamps. Something in his tone made me wary. I couldn't explain what exactly, just my military instinct, which had saved me so many times in Afghanistan, suddenly stirred like a disturbed alligator in the mud. But I pushed this feeling away. After all, this was just a scientific expedition. The swamp crawler started precisely at 8. I sat at the controls, getting used to the machine. It was much heavier than I expected, but the general principle remained the same. Tracks are tracks, whether on a tank or a swamp crawler. Behind me, in the living compartment, Lauren and the professor were setting up some equipment. The first hours of the journey passed in relative silence. Only the roar of the engine and the squelching of liquid mud under the tracks. Occasionally, Reed would approach the cabin, point out a direction on the map, tell something about the route. He smelled of expensive cologne, a strange, out-of-place aroma here. By noon, we were deep in the swamps, beyond the range of mobile coverage. An endless green sea stretched in all directions. Cypresses, entwined with Spanish moss, rose above the water like ancient guardians. Life teemed all around: birds, insects, reptiles. Their voices merged into a continuous chorus filling the space. Beautiful, isn't it, Ryan? Lauren sat down next to the driver's seat. I'm amazed every time. Such primeval wildness. It's mesmerizing. There's no one here but us for many miles around. Yes, I glanced at the instruments. Just hot. 98 degrees and humidity almost 100%. Oh, that's nothing, she laughed. Just wait until a couple of days from now when we reach the station. She cut herself off, and something in her voice made me wary again. I turned to her, but she had already moved back to the professor, who was quickly writing something on his tablet. Day gave way to evening, evening to a muggy tropical night. We continued moving, guided by GPS and instrument readings. I kept a course strictly southeast, where, according to coordinates, the Everglades Science Station was located. Maybe we should stop for the night, I suggested when the clock showed 9 in the evening. I've been at the controls for 16 hours. No, Reed answered too quickly. I mean, it's better to continue moving. There's a convenient spot for parking about 20 miles from here. I know it well. That feeling again, like a quiet alarm signal somewhere at the edge of consciousness. I looked in the rearview mirror. The professor was hurriedly whispering something to Lauren. She was nodding, biting her lip. We reached the parking spot around midnight. A small island of solid ground amid a sea of bogs. It really was convenient, as if someone had specially prepared this stop. While I was shutting down the engine and checking the systems, Reed and Lauren quickly organized dinner. Canned food, crackers, warm water from a thermos. We ate silently, each immersed in our own thoughts. I'll take the first watch, Reed volunteered when dinner was finished. You rest, tomorrow's a hard day. I settled on my camp cot, listening to the night sounds of the swamp, the croaking of frogs, the chirping of cicadas, the splashing of water. Lauren lay nearby, but I could feel she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too frequent, tense. Something wrong, I whispered. Everything's fine, her whisper trembled. Just nervous before an important experiment. She turned to the wall, showing with her entire demeanor that the conversation was over. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My head spun with fragments of thoughts, Lauren's strange behavior, incomprehensible glances exchanged with the professor, his too hasty answers. And beyond the walls of the swamp crawler, frogs croaked and cicadas chirped, indifferent to human fears and doubts. Somewhere out there in this green desert, the Everglades station awaited us, and something told me what I would see there would change everything. Dr. Reed sat in the cabin, staring into the darkness. His fingers absent-mindedly stroked something in his shirt pocket. After all, accidents in the swamps are such a common occurrence, especially when they're carefully planned, aren't they? Chapter 5, Coming to the Surface. The Everglades research station emerged from the morning mist like a ghost, first a blurred silhouette, then slowly taking shape in reality. I slowed down, peering through the windshield. Something was wrong, very wrong. Is this, is this a modern research station? I couldn't hide the bewilderment in my voice. Before us stood a dilapidated hut on rotting stilts, partially sunk into the swamp. The walls, blackened by time and moisture, barely held onto the skewed frame. Dark, cloudy, cracked glass filled the narrow windows. Above the roof, a rusted meteorological antenna stood lonely, the kind I had seen in meteorology textbooks from the 50s. Maybe we've gone off course. I turned to Lauren, but she averted her gaze. No, Reed's voice sounded unexpectedly firm. This is exactly the station, more the swamp crawler to the platform. Inside the hut, the air was stale and suffocatingly humid. It smelled of mold, rust, and something else, that special odor of abandonment, unmistakable. The flashlight beam picked out ancient instruments from the semi-darkness, covered with a thick layer of dust and mold. I slowly walked around the room, illuminating each corner. Here was a weather station, antiquated, with dimmed scales. Here was a rack with some sensors. They still bore faded inscriptions from the Cold War era. All this equipment had clearly stood here for decades. I don't understand. I stopped at the central console. The documents talk about modern equipment, latest generation monitoring systems, autonomous data collection stations, portable spectrometers. Where is all this? Lauren and Reed were silent. In the silence, only the sound of water dripping from the ceiling into a placed bucket could be heard. I pulled from my pocket a crumpled printout, a copy of the latest report on the station's equipment. Here, I pointed at the lines. Installed last year, $2.5 million just for equipment. Where is it? Ryan. Lauren took a step toward me, but Reed stopped her with a hand motion. You're observant, Captain, the professor smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Military habit of noticing details, or just natural suspicion. What's going on here? I felt a familiar wave rising inside, the one that always preceded combat. Science is happening, Captain. Real science. Reed walked around the room, lovingly stroking the old instruments. Do you know how much it costs to maintain such a station? How much money is needed for real research? And those bureaucrats in Washington, they want reports, figures, pretty graphs. They don't care where the data comes from. You're falsifying results. It wasn't a question. We're optimizing resources, he corrected me. Yes, the equipment is old, but it works. And the difference in budget goes to real research, to what truly matters. To what? Your accounts in the Cayman Islands. Lauren sobbed. I turned to her. She stood pressed against the wall, tears flowing down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't want to. It all started so long ago. And then I understood. Understood everything, her frequent expeditions, Reed's strange hints at our wedding, those glances they exchanged. I felt sick. How long? My voice was hoarse. How many years have you? 15, Reed answered for her. Since her student days, she was a talented girl, in all senses. He said this with such condescending tenderness that I was hit by a wave of pure animal rage. I stepped forward, but Reed was faster. A gun appeared in his hand, small, neat, utterly incongruous with the image of a scientist. Don't get heated, Captain. The professor wearily sat down on a creaking chair. Take a seat. Let's talk like adults. I remained standing, arms crossed over my chest. Lauren nervously fidgeted with the zipper on her pocket. Yes, we use old equipment, Reed spoke calmly, as if giving a lecture. Yes, we write about new equipment in reports. The difference goes to support our research staff salaries. By the way, have you ever wondered why your wife can afford such expensive field outfits, or where you got the money for that tour business? I felt the ground disappearing from under my feet. I slowly turned to Lauren. Is that true? Ryan, she faltered. That money went to a good cause, to our future, to your business. Which I thought was honestly earned. My voice sounded hollow, as if from a barrel. Listen, Captain, Reed rose. We're all doing our jobs here. Yes, not entirely legally. But was the war you served in legal? Weren't billions stolen there on military contracts? At least we spend money on science. On science, I laughed bitterly. On rusty instruments from half a century ago. A heavy silence hung in the room. Only water dripped from the ceiling, and floorboards creaked underfoot. And what now? I finally asked. Now we'll finish our work here. Reed took out his tablet. Fill out reports, check equipment. By the way, we need your help. See this point on the map. There's a weather beacon there, needs a check on its operation. It's not far, a couple of miles. And if I refuse, if I decide to report this to the authorities? You won't do that, Reed replied calmly. Because then Lauren will suffer too, and your business. You wouldn't betray your own wife, Ryan. You do love her, don't you? I looked at my wife. She stood with eyes lowered, silent. At that moment, I didn't yet know that her betrayal was much deeper than it seemed, that it wasn't just money between her and the professor. I would understand that later. Fine, I buttoned my shirt all the way up. Show me where this beacon is, and we'll return to our conversation when we get out of here. Right here, Reed showed a point on the map. Just go and check the signal. We'll prepare the reports in the meantime. I went out into the humid heat of the swamps. Water squelched underfoot. The air was thick as syrup. I walked forward, toward the indicated point, which was on the edge of a particularly deep bog with rare patches of quicksand, not suspecting that behind my back Reed was already taking a package of explosives from his backpack. The first explosion was supposed to sound in 20 minutes. Chapter 6, Immersion. I trudged through the swamp, feeling how the tropical heat drained my strength. 98 in the shade, this wasn't the Afghan sands. Here, heat kills slowly, insidiously. First, consciousness clouds, then clothes become soaked with sweat, and then I shook my head, driving away these thoughts. Now I needed to think about something else. The GPS coordinates led me to a small clearing among the cypresses. Something in the surrounding landscape seemed wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what exactly. Military intuition, which had saved me so many times in Afghanistan, now signaled alarm, but I continued moving forward. There was no choice. A gust of wind carried some sound from the direction of the station. I turned around. Through the veil of fog and tall grass, I saw a dark figure rapidly moving along my tracks. Dr. Reed, and something in his hands. The first explosion caught me by surprise. The ground beneath my feet shuddered, went in waves. The second explosion thundered almost immediately from another side. Now I understood everything. He wasn't planning to just shoot me. He wanted the swamp to do it for him. The quagmire under my feet began to spread with frightening speed. The sound was like the squelching of a giant maw, wet, greedy, sucking. I rushed back, but it was too late. The explosions had disturbed the fragile balance, turning solid ground into quicksand. Farewell, Captain, Reed's voice carried through the noise of the swamp. Nothing personal, just business. By the way, your wife is magnificent, simply magnificent. I watched as the professor's dark figure dissolved in the mist. The quagmire under my feet pulled me deeper and deeper. I took out my compass. The needle spun chaotically, confused by the explosions and possibly deposits of marsh gas. I was disoriented, alone, and the ground was literally disappearing from under my feet. I spent the first hour fighting panic and trying to assess the situation. I was stuck waist-deep in a liquid, sticky mass that drew me deeper with each movement. A classic quicksand trap. The more you struggle, the faster you sink. Around me, only impassable bogs and not a soul for many miles. The sun blazed mercilessly. The radio in my pocket was silent, either out of range or deliberately switched off at the base. The GPS navigator showed that solid ground was about a mile away. Under normal conditions, a trifle, but not when you're waist-deep in a quagmire. The heat intensified. I covered my head with my shirt trying to protect myself from sunstroke. I knew I had only two options. First, stay in place and slowly die from thirst, heat, or being pulled into the quagmire. Second, try to escape using everything at hand. Both options were almost hopeless, but the second at least gave a ghost of a chance. The thought came instantly. I remembered stories from locals about ancient survival techniques in the swamps, techniques taught to them by the swamp dwellers themselves. I began gathering long, hollow stems of water reeds growing nearby, tied them together. Then, the most difficult part, I started making a primitive raft from young tree trunks, fastening them with lianas. This raft was the only thing that could help me escape from the sucking quagmire. Heat and humidity transformed the world around into a blurred nightmare. Sweat poured into my eyes, every movement was a struggle. But I continued working, understanding that with each minute the quagmire was pulling me deeper. Finally, the raft was ready. I extended it in front of me, lay on it with my chest, slowly, carefully distributing the weight. The swamp sludge reluctantly released me, tearing me from its womb with a nasty squelching sound. Inch by inch, I pulled myself out until I was finally completely on the raft. Now came the hardest part, crossing the bog to the patch of solid ground shown by the GPS. Using a long pole made from a young cypress, I slowly pushed off, moving my primitive raft through the thick sludge. Time lost meaning. There was only the green half-light of the swamps, the suffocating heat, and the flickering point on the GPS screen I was striving toward. Sometimes I thought I saw the eyes of alligators watching me from the dark water. Or were these hallucinations from heat and dehydration? I don't remember how I reached the patch of dry land. The last meters merged into one blurred spot of pain and exhaustion. I only remember how my fingers clutched the roots of a mangrove tree, how my body refused to move, how consciousness floated into darkness. My last thought was survived again, like then in the burning helicopter. And then darkness fell, and in this darkness I seemed to hear someone's voices speaking in an unfamiliar language, and coolness, blessed coolness of others' touches. Chapter 7, Second Wind. Death smelled of swamp mud and tasted like stagnant water. I was sure of this until I woke up and smelled something else: smoke. Not the acrid smoke of a fire, not the stench of burning kerosene from a helicopter, but something ancient, reminiscent of herbs and damp bark, a smell that brought back to life. I opened my eyes. Above me was a ceiling of interwoven branches and leaves, through which blue sky peeked. I lay in a hut on stilts, a traditional dwelling of swamp inhabitants. I had once seen such huts in documentaries, but never thought I would find myself inside one. A fire in a small hearth cast bizarre shadows on the woven walls. Somewhere outside, the swamp murmured, that very sound which had nearly become the last thing I heard in life. Through the open doorway, I could see sunlight reflecting on water and silhouettes of water birds gliding over the marshes. I tried to move, and my body responded with a wave of pain. Every muscle, every joint reminded me of that desperate struggle with the quagmire. But I was alive. By some miracle, alive. An involuntary groan escaped my parched throat. Immediately a face appeared next to me. A young woman with olive skin and long black hair, braided into dozens of thin plaits with beads from seeds strung on them. She looked no more than 19. She bent over me, said something in an unfamiliar language, melodic, with deep guttural sounds. When she touched my forehead with a cool palm, I realized I had been burning with fever until this moment. Her touch was like an anchor, holding me in reality. She brought to my lips a clay bowl with some kind of brew. It smelled of bitter herbs and honey, but I drank greedily, like a man dying of thirst. "Ryan," I croaked, pointing at myself. The girl smiled. The smile transformed her face, making it resemble that of a forest nymph from ancient legends. Nimue. So began my new life. A life without familiar words, at least without understandable words. But the Kaido tribe, as I later learned, had lived for centuries in a world where words meant less than actions. Here, on lost islets among the swamps, where humidity approaches 100% and predators lurk at every step, only those survive who can read truth in another person's eyes. Later I learned how they found me. Hunters were looking for snakes for a ritual and noticed something strange on a small island. At first, they thought it was an alligator. But alligators don't wear clothes and don't bleed under the scorching sun. They brought me to the settlement, almost dead, with skin covered in blisters from sunburn and leech bites. The elders said it was a sign. A white man who used their ancient swamp survival methods must remain alive. They entrusted me to Nimue, the shaman's daughter, who knew the secrets of healing herbs and ancient rituals. Days merged into one endless stream of recovery. Nimue treated my wounds, rubbed my body with ointments that smelled of swamp herbs, gave me herbal teas. Gradually my strength returned, and I began to notice details of tribal life. Everything was different here. No locked doors, a hut's entrance is always open to guests. No secret deals, hunters shared their catch with the entire tribe. No lies, they simply made no sense here. How can you lie when your life depends on others' trust? Every morning I watched women weave mats. Men prepare boats for hunting, children play in the water, imitating movements of water snakes. A simple life, unchanged for centuries. And in this simplicity was such honesty, such purity, that it made my heart ache. I thought about Lauren and Reed, about their multi-million machinations, about how easily they decided to kill a man for money, about that artificial world of fake reports and falsified data they had built. Here, among the Kaido tribe, all of it seemed so insignificant, empty. Nimue seemed to understand me without words. When heavy thoughts overwhelmed me, she would simply sit nearby. Sometimes she sang quiet songs in her language, similar to the whisper of wind in the reeds. Sometimes she just remained silent, sorting herbs or working on weaving baskets. She was beautiful with that special beauty you won't find in glossy magazines. Her movements were full of natural grace, and in her eyes lived some ancient wisdom, passed down through generations of women of her people. Next to her, I felt a strange calmness, as if after an endless storm I had finally entered a quiet harbor. One evening she brought me new clothes, light pants and a shirt made from some local fabric, impregnated with protective oils. In every stitch was care, the very thing I had so lacked in my past life. Helping me dress, she momentarily held her hands on my shoulders. Our eyes met, and I saw in hers a reflection of the fire that was already kindling in my own soul. That night we didn't need a common language. The language of the body proved more ancient than all human dialects. Her skin smelled of swamp herbs and hearth smoke. Her kisses were unskilled but sincere, like everything in this world where pretense is impossible. Later, as we lay on woven mats, looking at the stars through the open doorway, I thought about the quirks of fate, about how it led me through the sands of Afghanistan, through betrayal and swamp hell to bring me here, to this pure-souled girl, to these people, to this simple and honest life. Nimue laid her head on my chest and quietly sang something. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the meaning. Here, on the edge of civilization, where people don't lock doors and don't betray each other, where truth is valued above gold and love above power. Ahead of me lay the road back to the station, to the traitors, to justice. But now I had a reason to return. Nimue slept in my arms, and in the light of the dying hearth, I could see a slight smile on her lips. I didn't know then that this night would change not only my life, but also the life of an entire tribe. I just lay there, listening to the whisper of swamps outside, and for the first time in a long while felt truly alive. Chapter 8: Path of Retribution. The old shaman, whom everyone simply called Father of Waters, laid a map before me. A piece of tanned leather with patterns of plant dyes and symbols I could only vaguely interpret. The map must have reflected traditions of many generations who lived among these impassable swamps. "Path dangerous," said Father of Waters through a young hunter who knew a few English words. "3 sons, maybe 4 if big rain." I examined the map, trying to correlate natural landmarks with what I remembered from GPS. The station should be somewhere here, about 60 miles to the southeast. With luck and weather, I could reach it in a dugout canoe in 3 to 4 days. Nimue stood aside, pretending to be busy preparing supplies, but I saw her casting furtive glances at me. In the 2 weeks spent in the settlement, I had learned to read her face like an open book. Now it showed concern, not for herself, for me. The boat was ready for the long journey, a light dugout from a cypress trunk, with a paddle of hard wood. The water's surface reflected the morning sun in millions of gleams, and the air was already beginning to heat up, promising another humid day. "Boat knows way," explained the young hunter, showing me how to navigate the labyrinth of channels. "Main thing, trust water. It carries its secrets, its dangers. If water changes color or smell, means deep pit nearby or poisonous vapors." I nodded, absorbing every word. My life now depended on this knowledge, ancient wisdom of people who had survived for centuries in the most treacherous swamps on the planet. Funny how fate sometimes delivers lessons to me, a former helicopter pilot, now having to trust a fragile wooden shell. Just before departure, Nimue brought me a small pouch made of alligator skin. Inside were some herbs. Their bitter aroma reminded me of the first days in the hut when she nursed me back to health after the deadly encounter with the quagmire. "Medicine," translated the hunter. "If snake bites put on wound, will help." She wanted to say something else, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply pressed against my chest, so fragile and simultaneously strong in her simple clothes of plant fibers. I embraced her, inhaling the familiar smell of herbs and smoke. Already sitting in the boat, I looked back at the settlement one last time. Nimue stood by her hut, her long braids with beads swaying steadily in the light breeze. She raised her hand in a farewell gesture, and something in this movement made my heart contract. I didn't yet know one of her little secrets. A short push with the paddle, and the boat slid into the channel. The first day of the journey passed relatively calmly. The weather was clear, the dugout easily glided between thickets of cypresses and mangrove trees, and navigation skills came surprisingly naturally. Perhaps piloting experience was showing. The same sense of balance, the same need to read air currents, only now they were water currents. During stops, I would take out the map, check it against the homemade compass the Kaido had given me. The main thing was not to lose course. In this green labyrinth, it's easy to lose direction. One mistake could cost a life. By evening of the second day, the weather began to deteriorate. Heavy clouds covered the sky, deepening the already dense shadows of the swamps. The water seemed to darken, becoming thicker and more viscous. There was tension in the air, foretelling a storm. I made camp earlier than usual, fashioning from the boat and several branches something like a shelter on a small island amid the quagmire. In the noise of wind, swaying the treetops, I heard voices. Perhaps they were the swamp spirits the Kaido spoke of. The morning of the third day brought downpour. A wall of water crashed onto the swamps, turning them into one seething mess. Visibility dropped to a few meters, but I continued my journey. I knew that somewhere ahead, answers awaited me. And justice. The station appeared suddenly. At some point, a dark silhouette emerged through the curtain of rain. Everything was as I remembered: a tilting hut on half-rotten stilts, a rusted antenna on the roof. Only the swamp crawler tracks had long been flooded by rising water. Inside it was damp and empty. Mold and fungus covered the old instruments. Wind whistled through cracks between boards. I methodically went through the rooms until I found what I was looking for: a radio station. My heart beat faster. Finally, I could call for help, tell authorities my coordinates. But when I turned on the power, the speaker responded only with static. The transmitter was broken carefully and professionally. Reed and my wife, they had foreseen such a possibility. I cursed. All my plans were crumbling. And then through the static, a signal broke through. It seemed the professor had broken the station only for transmission, but it still worked for reception. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The classic distress signal known to every sailor and pilot. I pressed my ear to the receiver, listening for coordinates. The signal came from the east, about 30 miles from here. And the source was well familiar to me: that very Marlin swamp crawler in which Lauren and Reed had escaped. "Got you bastards," I whispered, taking out the map. "Seems without my skills you couldn't escape this green hell." They were stuck somewhere in the wilderness, unable to move further. Knowing their level of preparation for survival in the swamps, they had at most a couple of days before thirst, heat, and predators would take their toll. I looked at my boat. It had dried after the rain and was ready for a new journey. In my bag, Nimue's brew remained. Supplies lay in the boat. I could simply leave them there, let nature take its course of justice. It would be fair. But then I remembered Nimue's face, her kindness, and the wisdom of her people. Remembered how the Kaido saved me, asking no questions. In their world there was no place for vengeance, only for mercy and justice. A short push with the paddle, and the boat turned east. Somewhere there, in the labyrinths of swamps, the conclusion of this story awaited me. I didn't know then what I would find in the stranded swamp crawler, didn't know what other betrayals would be revealed to me. I simply did what I had to do, as the Kaido taught me, as Nimue taught me. The boat slid between cypresses, dissolving in the green half-light. A new downpour was beginning, but now it didn't frighten me. I knew, to find truth, sometimes you need to go through the storm. Chapter 9: Price of Betrayal. I discovered the Marlin swamp crawler at dawn of the 3rd day. It was stuck in a huge funnel, resembling a giant maw torn in the green carpet of vegetation. The machine's yellow paint was covered with a layer of slime, tracks hopelessly mired in liquid mud. A flock of swamp birds, disturbed by my approach, rose into the sky with cries. I directed the boat to a small patch of relatively solid ground nearby. Something about this picture seemed wrong. Too quiet. Even for swamps, too quiet. I took out from inside my shirt the binoculars, a gift from an old hunter of the tribe. The machine stood at an angle, as if trying to escape the trap and freezing halfway. Tracks on the damp soil told a story of several desperate attempts to break free. Deep furrows from the tracks, scattered branches that are usually placed under wheels for better traction. But now all this had turned into a single mass, swallowed by the insatiable quagmire. "Wait here," I told the birds, though they weren't planning to fly away anyway. As I approached the swamp crawler, the picture became increasingly grim. The cabin windows were covered with condensation from the inside, a bad sign. It meant it was too humid inside. The exhaust pipe was clean of slime. They had tried to keep the engine running until the last moment. I knocked on the side door. Something stirred inside. A weak voice was heard. "Help, please." Inside the Marlin, the air was so humid it seemed you could wring it out like a sponge. The flashlight beam picked out 2 figures from the gloom. They sat huddled together under a pile of blankets and jackets. Lauren was shivering, her face covered with an unhealthy flush. Reed looked not much better. His always neat gray beard had turned into a tangled mess, and fear was frozen in his eyes. "God, Ryan," Lauren's voice trembled. "Is it really you? We thought, we were sure that I was dead." I allowed bitterness to seep into my voice. "Sorry to disappoint." "Listen, Captain," Reed tried to give his voice its usual professorial confidence, but it came out poorly. "I understand you may be upset, even angry at us, but now is not the time for what, Professor? For truth." Something in my tone made them both fall silent. In the cramped space of the swamp crawler, silence hung, broken only by the sound of rain outside and Lauren's heavy breathing. "How long have you been here?" I asked, examining empty cans of food. "6 days," Lauren whispered. Food ran out yesterday." Her voice broke and suddenly it burst. "Ryan, forgive me for everything. I'm such a fool, such a blind idiot." Tears mixed with sweat on her face. "I didn't want you dead, I swear. When you went to check that beacon, I didn't even know about the explosives. But you knew about everything else." My voice was quiet, almost gentle, and that made it even more frightening. "Why, yes," she sobbed. "About the money, about the fake reports, about what else, Lauren?" Reed jerked. "Don't." "Shut up," I bellowed with such force that both of them flinched. "I want to hear everything now." And Lauren told about 15 years of involvement with Reed, beginning when she was still in university, about how he charmed her, young, ambitious student with his intellect and power, how he pulled her into his schemes, how their scientific work turned into a money-laundering scheme. And all this time, I felt something cold and terrible growing inside. All these years of our marriage. "I loved you," she exclaimed, "truly loved you, but I got confused." She tried to stand but cried out in pain. I noticed her feet swollen, covered with blisters, obvious signs of infection. Without immediate help, she would lose them. "Captain," Reed spoke up. A wheedling tone appeared in his voice. "I understand your feelings, but right now the main thing is to survive. You have a boat, you have supplies, we can." I laughed, and from this laughter both of them flinched again. "You really think that after everything?" "Please," Lauren stretched her hands toward me. "For the sake of what was between us. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but would you leave me to die here?" She was shaking now, not only from fever. Hysteria had begun. I looked at the woman I once loved and felt a strange emptiness inside. And then I remembered Nimue, her kindness, her wisdom, her people who saved me without asking questions. "All right," I said finally. "To the nearest settlement is about 3 days' journey by boat, if we leave at dawn." "Thank you," Lauren exhaled. "Thank you, I." "Don't thank me too soon," I cut her off. "First we have to survive this night." I went out to check the boat and collect more water from a relatively clean stream nearby. Returning, I saw Lauren shaking even harder. "If the fever isn't brought down, she won't live until morning," Reed said matter-of-factly, as if speaking about some scientific experiment. I silently took out from my bag Nimue's brew and the pouch with herbs. Lauren looked at me with distrust and hope simultaneously. "Just so she doesn't die here," I said dryly. "Nothing more." The night dragged on endlessly. Lauren gradually calmed down, the fever subsided somewhat. Sometimes she whimpered in her sleep, mumbled something about forgiveness. Reed sat opposite, leaning against the wall, pretending to doze, but I could feel his gaze on me. I dozed off toward morning when the sky behind the murky windows began to turn gray. I woke from a strange silence. No sound came from outside. I sat up sharply. Reed wasn't there. I rushed outside. The boat had disappeared. The old fox had calculated everything. Waited until I fell asleep, grabbed my boat and supplies, leaving us to die in the mired swamp crawler. The tracks headed east but quickly disappeared in the boundless swamps. Returning to the machine, I saw despair in Lauren's eyes. She understood everything without words. "He abandoned us," she whispered, "like the last." She didn't finish. From outside came a strange sound, as if something large had splashed into the water, then a guttural growl, and a human scream, high, full of terror. Alligators. I knew they hunted in these places, had seen their tracks yesterday but didn't pay attention. Now I understood. Reed saw them too. That's why he fled, hoping the predators would occupy themselves with the stuck swamp crawler while he escaped. The screams quieted quickly, and an hour later the downpour eased slightly, and I could go out to scout. What I found 100 meters to the east had once been Dr. Victor Reed. Now it was only remains on bloodied ground, next to an overturned boat. My boat had capsized, evidently in panic. Reed couldn't control it. The clever predator, sensing prey, attacked precisely and mercilessly. People sometimes prove stupider than alligators. I turned the boat over, retrieved from under the seat a spare bottle of water and a pouch of herbs that miraculously hadn't been washed away. Then I returned to the swamp crawler. Here everything was supposed to end, but not as the traders had planned. Differently. I had one more chance. In my backpack were ropes provided by the Kaido. If I wove them into a towing cable and used the nearest trees as leverage. Lauren silently watched as I prepared for the operation to free the swamp crawler. In her eyes was no longer pleading or hope, only resignation. An understanding that whatever the outcome of this story, the past could never be regained. I secured the last rope, looked east, where through the clouds the first rays of sun were breaking. Somewhere there was the Kaido settlement and Nimue. I began winding the cable onto a makeshift winch. It was time to finish this story. Chapter 10: Through the Bogs. The winch creaked like a door to the realm of the dead. The quagmire around the swamp crawler went in waves, like a living creature unwilling to release its prey. I leaned on the lever with my whole body, feeling joints crack, every muscle strain. One more turn, and another. The swamp crawler shuddered, spewed a cloud of foul gas. Then again, and again. On the fourth attempt it finally moved, slowly, agonizingly slowly, but the machine began to escape its sucking captivity. Lauren lay in the back part of the swamp crawler, wrapped in all the dry rags we could find. Her feet. I tried not to think about her feet. The main thing now was to reach civilization. To the nearest village was about 100 miles, 2, maybe 3 days' journey if weather permitted. Weather didn't permit. Downpour covered us 4 hours after we started moving. Sky and earth merged into one greenish-gray nightmare. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The compass showed we were moving west, but I was no longer sure if the magnetic needle could be trusted in these swamps, where ore deposits lay hidden under layers of silt. "Forgive me," Lauren's voice was barely audible over the noise of rain and the roar of the engine. "Forgive me for everything." "Be quiet," I cut her off. "I need to concentrate." But she couldn't be quiet. Words poured out of her like pus from an infected wound. "I really loved you in the beginning, really. But then, it's like a drug, you understand. Money, power, secret meetings. Reed knew which buttons to push. He knew how to make a person feel special. And then decided to get rid of you as soon as you became a burden." I peered into the green gloom ahead. "Left you to die in the swamp crawler. Romantic, I must say." She sobbed. "You know what's the scariest thing? I wasn't surprised. Somewhere deep inside, I always knew he was capable of this. I just didn't want to believe it." The fuel ran out toward the end of the second day. We had covered about 2/3 of the way to St. Aubin. The engine coughed one last time and died. In the ensuing silence, the sound of rain drumming on the metal roof was especially loud. "That's it?" Lauren asked. "Is this the end?" I checked the radio for the 100th time. Through the interference, fragments of conversations occasionally broke through, which meant we were already in the range of civilian frequencies. I began transmitting a distress signal, again and again. Help came after 20 hours. First, we heard the chatter of a helicopter, then saw red flashes of signal lights through the rain curtain. Rescuers appeared like ghosts, in orange suits, with medical equipment and thermoses of hot coffee. Lauren was taken away first. Her feet were covered with festering blisters. Urgent hospitalization was required. I watched as the helicopter rose into the sky, carrying away my past life, and felt a strange emptiness. At the hospital, they were already waiting for us. Not only doctors, FBI agents also showed interest in the story of a missing scientific expedition. They were especially interested in the documents I had taken from the station before going to search for the swamp crawler. Everything spun like in a tornado whirlwind. Interrogations, testimonies, examinations. The entire grant scheme was exposed. Millions of dollars disappeared into nowhere. Fake reports about equipment that never existed. Bribes to officials from the grant committee. The story hit the newspapers. Swamp fraud, scientific swindlers, corruption in academic circles. Headlines proclaimed the sensation. Lowland University found itself at the center of the scandal. Lauren lost her right leg below the knee. The infection had gone too deep. Doctors could do nothing. When I came to her ward, the one and only time, she didn't even turn her head. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, standing by the door. "I know," her voice was lifeless. "Is it because of my betrayal, or did you find someone else?" "Both. Is she a good person?" "Better than you and I." Lauren finally turned to me. In her eyes were no tears, only endless weariness. "You know, now it seems to me I would have been better off dying than in the swamp crawler." I silently left the ward. In my pocket were divorce papers and a ticket for a small seaplane that was to take me to the Kaido settlement, to Nimue. But first, I needed to finish all formalities. Give final testimonies, sign papers, put an end to this story of lies and betrayal. Leaving the hospital, I turned up my jacket collar against the muggy tropical downpour. Somewhere out there, beyond these walls of water, a new life awaited me. Simple and honest, like the people who saved me from death. Like the girl who nursed me back to health and gave her heart, asking nothing in return. The rainy season was beginning, my first in these parts. Streams of water washed dust from the streets, as if trying to cleanse the world of accumulated dirt. But I knew, some stains cannot be washed away even by the strongest rain. I caught a taxi and gave the address of my lawyer's office. I needed to hurry. In 2 days, a seaplane was waiting for me. Chapter 11, Way Home. The small beaver seaplane hummed like an angry bee, making its way through curtains of rain. The swamps below seemed endless, a green carpet pierced by silver veins of channels. I sat with my temple pressed against the vibrating window glass, thinking about how curiously the thread of fate weaves. A month ago, I wandered here on a frail boat, trying to survive. Now I was returning, no longer as a fugitive but as a man who had found his path. "Can't fly further," shouted the pilot over the roar of the engine. "See that channel? Your friends are somewhere there. If you're lucky, they'll hear the plane." I nodded. I knew the Kaido had already heard us. For people who had lived for centuries by hunting, any sound, any movement in the sky doesn't go unnoticed. The plane landed on a relatively wide stretch of the channel. Water splashed up in a fan of spray from the floats. Before I could unload my backpack, silhouettes appeared on the shore, hunters in boats. They seemed to materialize from the green thicket like spirits of this ancient land. They recognized me immediately. The young hunter, the same one who taught me to handle a dugout, jumped from his boat and embraced me firmly. Words were unnecessary. A handshake, a smile, a nod toward the settlement. Welcome home. Nimue waited at the entrance to her hut. She stood motionless like a statue, only the numerous beads in her braids quietly jingled in the breeze. As I approached, I noticed changes, a barely noticeable roundness of her belly under the simple tunic, a special gleam in her eyes. She knew, and knew I would return. Our embrace was long. She smelled of swamp herbs, hearth smoke, and something else, that special scent of life that was forming inside her. I knelt, pressed my cheek to her belly. I couldn't tell her in words how much this meant to me, but she didn't need words. The following days merged into one endless moment of happiness. The settlement accepted me as one of their own, simply and naturally, without extra ceremonies. The elders blessed our union with Nimue. The shaman performed an ancient ritual, calling upon swamp spirits to protect the unborn child. Life in the tribe flowed according to its own laws, unchanged for centuries. Each morning hunters went out for game. Women took care of the household. Children played in shallow water, imitating movements of water snakes. I learned everything. How to track prey by barely visible traces on water, how to predict weather by bird flight, how to make boats from a single tree trunk. And in the evenings we sat by the hearth, and Nimue taught me the language of her people. The words were melodic, songful, unusual for my tongue, but I tried. Each learned word was like a bridge between my past life and the new reality. Our son was born on the rainiest night of the season. The birth was attended by an old healer, the same one who had done this for 3 generations of the tribe. When the first cry of the child sounded, an especially strong storm broke over the swamps. Lightning cut the sky with fiery arrows, as if greeting the new person. I held my son in my arms and saw in his face features of both peoples, his mother's olive skin and my gray eyes, the Kaido's curly hair and my stubborn chin. A little bridge between 2 worlds. "What shall we name him?" I asked Nimue in her language. Over the past months, I had learned to speak enough to express the most important things. She smiled and named a name, an ancient name of her people, meaning born in thunder. I repeated it, feeling how it settled on my tongue, correctly, as if it had always been part of my life. Sometimes, on particularly humid nights, when rain drummed on the hut's roof, I thought about my past. About the burning helicopter in Afghanistan, about Lauren's betrayal, about the deadly struggle with the quagmire. Each trial, each pain led me here, to this woman, to this child, to this simple and honest life. One morning I saw in the distance the smoke of a motorboat. Somewhere out there, another scientific expedition was passing. Perhaps again with false reports and stolen millions. But now it wasn't my concern. My world had narrowed to the boundaries of the settlement, to the warmth of our hut, to my son's smile and Nimue's embraces. In summer, when the rainy season gave way to a period of suffocating heat, my son and I sat on the porch of our hut. The boy played with a wooden toy I had carved for him, and I looked west, where the green wall of jungle gave way to swamps. "There's a big world out there, son," I said in English, though the boy didn't yet understand words. "A complex world. Someday you'll learn about it, but here is our home." Nimue called us for dinner. I took my son in my arms and went to the hut, where embers of the hearth glowed and the woman who had given me a new life waited. Behind remained our footprints on the damp earth, large and small, intertwined like threads of fate. And over the swamps, storm clouds gathered again, indifferent to human dramas, eternal as nature itself. In their shadow, the future seemed as pure and full of life as the green thickets surrounding our settlement. If you enjoyed this story, please support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.